Okay, good morning. Guten Morgen, everyone. Welcome back to Business Management. We're going to basically look at today with regards to the classes that we missed over the past 2 weeks. So I'm actually going to be doing two videos today. The first one is about strategic management. The second one is actually on base of organizing. So we'll start off with strategic management, and I'll actually make a separate video for organizing after this. So let's start with strategic management. I think the one thing that I need to emphasize at the beginning is the idea of what is strategic management. I think a lot of people always find that strategic management as a particular concept to provide possible answers or possible solutions, but that's actually technically wrong. I think everyone actually has to have an understanding that strategic management is actually a tool utilized by managers or CEOs or any particular person in a supervisory role in regards to developing options. And I think options actually create momentum for particular managers to actually make the right decisions. So therefore, we have to be mindful that strategic management is always a basis as a tool actually to basically deal with particular issues, problems, or particular paradox concepts that every company actually has to encounter. Now, the good thing is, with regards to strategic management is, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that what we're doing today will not be actually going into in-depth approach of strategic management where we'll be looking at algorithms or probabilities or time series or regression, but we're looking at the concept of why managers actually have to utilize the usage of strategic management as a tool. So if we look at the first slide, it's just an introduction. Let's go into the second slide, which looks at what is strategy. And I think every particular manager has to be mindful towards the idea of usage of strategy. Every company has to create a strategy in place in order for them to make sure to maintain their competitive advantage in order to basically outpace their competition. But in a simpler version of it, every particular company, if you look at it like a football or a soccer team, they always use a different strategy depending on the particular competition that they are actually going against. So that's something that I think every particular person as a managerial position needs to understand. And if you can see from the second slide, strategy is the overall plan of deploying resources to establish a favorable position. Now, this is something that I think every particular manager needs to encompass and have a very deep understanding about. Therefore, you have to be mindful that sometimes companies actually have to create strategies according to what particular location they're doing business in or what particular competition that they are actually going against. So that's something that I think every particular manager should always basically have in mind. Therefore, you have to be mindful that strategies have to be modified or basically adjusted according to the particular conditions or situations that you're encountering. However, there is actually one particular factor that I think we need to also be mindful of, which is tactics. Now, tactics is something that I think everyone has to be mindful in regards to strategy implementation. The factor of tactics, it's actually where we always have to assume that companies never break rules. They always try to bend them to the maximum just to make sure of what they are actually able to do or what to the maximum they are actually able to basically manipulate. Now, we have to be mindful, if we use the example of soccer or football as an example, I think every particular person here that actually has a very fond fascination towards football or soccer understands the concept of diving. Now, this is also a very interesting tactic. It may not technically be legal, but it's a tactic that actually is mostly practiced by a lot of teams. And the main goal for actually using this particular aspect of diving or pretending to fall down to get a free kick or yellow card or red card for the opposite opponent or one of your particular competitors is something that is very common in the game of soccer or football. So you have to be mindful towards this particular concept. Next, we actually have to look at the aspect of strategy. So in regards to basic framework of strategy, we have to be mindful that strategy is actually also encompassed by both internal and also external factors. So we have to be mindful that these particular factors can actually contribute towards how you actually create a specific strategy within any particular environment. And we have to be mindful that managers have to create this momentum of analyzing or undertaking environmental scanning in order for them to actually maintain or create a good strategy. Now, strategic management, if we go on to the third slide, the purpose of strategic management is pretty much straightforward, as I did state to you at the beginning. It is actually utilized as a particular tool to provide managers or CEOs options in order for you to create the most appropriate decision. And I do need to emphasize this and again. The one that creates the decision or determines the decision is always going to still be the manager or the CEO. So therefore, we always have to be mindful to that particular concept. And if we continue on the fourth slide, strategic decisions in regards to strategic management are always categorized as important. Now, a lot of particular companies always emphasize the idea that strategic management is always used as a tool to basically create the best possible options in regards to paradox questions or paradox situations. And I do need to emphasize paradox. I think we've already talked about a paradox where it's a hard question with also hard consequences. The question is how or what way you actually create the greater good for everyone involved. And I think this is something that strategic management always is used for in order to basically calculate the best possible option to take or best possible route to take or decision to make to basically utilize the minimum amount of disruption or problems in regards to making the most inappropriate decisions itself. And strategic decisions always involve a significant commitment of resources. And I think this is something that I think every manager needs to understand. Whenever we use the word resources, it always actually looks at the efficiency factor of allocation towards both human resources, natural resources, and also capital resources. So therefore, you have to be mindful whenever we do a strategic decision based on strategic management options, they are always going to be a significant degree of commitment by all resources that are basically at the company's disposal. The third, it is not easily reversible. And for example, if you create a strategy, it is possible to modify, change, or even basically completely change a strategy, but truthfully, it is not easy. No one said it would actually be easy, therefore, it actually takes a significant degree of time and also resources to actually create a new strategy in place. So these are basic things that we need to understand. And this also goes back to the basic framework, as I just stated to you previously in regards to environmental scanning. And you can see from this slide, on slide 5, that the strategy itself is both affected by internal factors and also external factors. And a good manager needs to understand of how to balance these both out in order to create the most effective strategy. And if we go straight into slide 6, now strategic management as a process itself is a full set of commitments, decisions, and actions required for a firm to create value and earn above average returns. And I think this is something that we need to understand in regards to creating value creation. So we have to be mindful towards value creation because for the factor it creates momentum for customers to consume our products again and again and again. Therefore, this is something I think every manager should also remember. When you create value, it creates momentum for the perception of a customer that they've actually gained something more than they actually paid for. And this is something that creates momentum for customer satisfaction and customer loyalty. So value creation, I think, is something that we also have to be mindful. And you can see a lot of examples of value creation by companies, like, for example, companies offering you free service for your car or for a new car that you buy for the next 10 years. This is value creation, creating value. So the perception of the customer is that, oh, I'm buying this car for this significant price and I'm getting a benefit of a free service for the next X amount of years. So this is also something that we have to be mindful of, value creation. And I think also if you guys and girls also have to have an understanding is that if you like, do you guys and girls like eating Pringles as an example? Pringles actually has value creation adding activities on the box. So you have to be mindful towards this. Like for example, you have an expiry date, that's also a value creating activity. Then you have also ingredients within the product itself, that is also a value adding activity. So all these value adding activities create momentum for people to actually create confidence in consuming a product or a service that they've actually paid for. So this is also an example. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory towards what is value creation, as what is achieved when a firm successfully formulates and implements a strategy that other companies are unable to duplicate or find costly to imitate. Now, also from a value perspective from a company, you also have to be mindful. Value creation is also on the idea of competitive advantage, where you create something that's not easily duplicated or not easily imitated or find it costly for other companies to duplicate itself. And I think this is something that I think every particular company also needs to remember. Understanding what you create value towards your customer base and also what you create value on the basis of your brand acknowledgement or brand image, actually. So to continue, the most interesting aspect is, ladies and gentlemen, is that in regards to creating or using strategic management, at the end of the day, because this is a profit-orientated companies we're talking about, it always looks at the idea of making as much money as possible. So therefore, we always have that idea of average returns, or even basically exceeding that particular idea of creating above average returns itself. So we always have to be mindful that the main goal at the end of the day is actually creating sustainable growth and profitability. However, every company will always want to actually create momentum to actually create above average returns where they actually make more money than they were actually initially expecting. I think this is the most ideal version of it, but in reality, I think every particular manager should always be grounded to the concept that you have to be a realist to make sure that you actually attain what you are basically able to sustain for, and then actually if anything is more than exceeding than your expectations, then you are actually already in the profit-orientated concept of a strategy. Now, after understanding the concept of above average returns and also average returns, we always have to go to the next slide, which is on slide 8, which looks at the idea of risk association. I think this is something that I think every particular person or manager needs to understand. Risk is always associated with business, and I think this is something that I think every particular manager should realize. You can never eliminate risk. You can minimize it to a point, but you can never eliminate it completely. So therefore, we have to be mindful towards the factors of uncertainty and gains and losses that will result from a particular investment. I think a very good example of this is probably this year in 2020 with regards to the pandemic. This is probably a very good example of a risk association. A lot of companies did not deal very well towards their risk association towards the idea of actually having a pandemic affecting their sales of their products and services. But a lot of companies actually are very good at adapting towards these changes. Therefore, you have to be mindful of how to create momentum in order for you to minimize and navigate these particular risk aspects of uncertainty. So therefore, we have to be mindful towards these changes in regards to creating profitable growth. Like we see a lot of companies right now that are struggling. I think one of the most interesting ones is the airline companies are actually struggling, and a lot of airline companies are actually grounding their fleets. Another one is Airbnbs are actually also struggling as well right now. So these are particular industries or tour and travel companies. Like in Bali, as we can probably see directly, is the tourism industry right now is going through a very hard time. So therefore, risk association by using strategic management is actually quite interesting for the factor to prepare companies to deal with possible situations like we're encountering now. I think in the future, companies will use strategic management to look at possibilities of what particular outcomes may come and how to deal with them, particularly in regards to both natural disasters, pandemics, or even war or terrorism. So these factors have to be put in mind to ensure that companies can create continuous momentum and adaptability and flexibility towards any particular uncertainty within the environments. So if we continue on slide 9, features in the strategic management process. You have to be mindful, strategic management in its nature should always be created as a proactive aspect, where you are basically preparing for the inevitable situation of things that may or may not occur. And the next one, it's not a quick fix as well. The third, it is part of quality management or total quality management. And last but not least, the payoffs increase over time. And this is something I think every particular manager should always remember. Strategic management always looks at the long-term perspective rather than the short-term perspective. Okay, so to continue, about strategic management on slide 10, plans must be tailored to the organization. Not all sizes fits all, and that's true. you have to be mindful. Not every strategic plan is a copy and paste situation. You have to be mindful that every situation that may seem similar is actually very dissimilar. So you have to be mindful of this, and every company should always be fundamentally diligent towards these particular situations. The third, time to complete tasks are actually much longer. Expect 50% more than actually planned. The process needs a particular shepherd or particular change agent to actually help in the process of these transitions of change. And last but not least, truthfully, visionaries are needed at the beginning and the detail types thereafter. I think we always have to be mindful. Visionaries of a company always create momentum to basically create this particular change that is categorized as strategic. And a good example of this is Apple, I think, is a success story that we see today. Steve Jobs actually had to be fired from Apple and then rehired again by Apple to actually create the new vision of what Apple is that we see today. So this is something that I think has transformed Apple based on Steve Jobs' perception, that is changing the perspective that we're seeing Apple as a particular IT product, but evolving into a lifestyle product where we are basing the idea of purchasing Apple because it's Apple. It's not because it's the most advanced product, but it's an Apple product. So that gives you an idea. And I think the iPhone 12 that is recently just reintroduced is a very good example of that. Everyone that is buying that product is basing it on the idea that it's an Apple product, not on the basis that it's the most advanced product itself. So we have to be mindful of that idea. Now, to continue, let's look at the competitive landscape on slide 11. So we actually always have to be mindful towards hyper-competitive environments, and the changing nature of these competitive environments is actually one of the most important things that every manager should always monitor. The dynamics of strategic maneuvering among global innovative combatants is actually one of the most interesting ones, where we have to be mindful that competition now is not from our region anymore, but it actually is from everywhere around the world. A lot of people don't really realize that a lot of products come from different locations around the world. Like Alibaba is the largest e-commerce company that comes from China. You have WhatsApp, which originally was not made in America, actually, but ladies and gentlemen, it's actually created in the Ukraine by Jan Koum and his friends. And then you have, for example, in Indonesia right now, we have Unicorn Company, which is probably the most popular in Asia if you do come in the future, which is called Gojek, which is a food delivery service that every company around the world is copying. So like, for example, Deliveroo or Uber Eats, these companies have actually copied and pasted the Gojek formula to actually create the momentum as you would probably see now in your home country. I think in Germany there are probably good examples of other companies that are also selling products and services, not products and services, that are doing delivery services for food actually to your home via online services. And this is actually a Gojek particular technique that was created and also made popular by Gojek in Indonesia. Then you have price and quality positioning, or well know-how, or first mover advantage. Now, price and quality positioning is something that I think every company should always do whenever entering upon a new market, by understanding the concept of where you are in comparison to your competition. And then knowing more information about your market or potential target market is also one of the most interesting things. But I think the third one on this one is highly debatable. First mover advantage depends on the company and how they actually maintain themselves. Some companies are first into a country or into a market and they create momentum with their market. Doesn't mean they will dominate, and that's something that I think we have to be mindful of. Okay? Some companies actually are a follower strategy, which actually wait and see until the first company actually does something wrong to execute it completely. And I think a very good example of this is actually Pepsi and Coca-Cola. Pepsi have always used that particular technique of being a first mover within any new market. However, Coca-Cola have always used a wait and see strategy to look at what Pepsi do wrong first before they come in and execute it correctly. And Coca-Cola have always dominated. And this is something I think every particular manager should always remember. The third particular aspect is protect and invade established products or geographic markets. I think this is actually a very common technique nowadays within the global combatants. So we have to be mindful that a lot of companies now are expanding their capacity by invading or going into other new markets that have been dominated by other particular industries or particular companies. So this is something that of change. And then Within this, you have the emergence of global economy, you have goods and services and peoples and skills, ideas move freely across geographic borders due to the most impressive invention of the 21st century, which is WWW, or the World Wide Web, or basically internet. Therefore, creating the momentum of this emergence of a global economy, spread of economic innovations through the world, like a 24-hour system on the stock exchange, which runs from Monday to Friday every week. Then you have the political and cultural adjustments that are required to deal with these particular accessibilities towards information, cultural differences, and so on and so forth that actually the internet has given everyone. So we have to be mindful of these particular factors as well. So to continue, then you have the rapid pace of technology. And I did state to you before, the best invention of the 21st century is the internet technically, and this has created a very interesting progression towards increased rate of change and diffusion of new technologies throughout the world, and has given rise to information age and also social media. This particular factor has created momentum in regards to a lot of changes in demographics, a lot of changes in tastes and preferences, and even in political situations. I think a very good example of this is that you can actually see with regards to the American presidency at the moment with regards to their campaigning that will actually take place in the presidential elections in the United States of America on the 2nd of December, if I'm not mistaken. This actually creates momentum for particular aspects of technology to be actually used not for an idea of just sharing information, but as actually a tool to actually undermine or even to create bad press or bad information towards opposing political views or political candidates. So this is something that I think every particular person needs to remember. And then you have the increasing knowledge intensity. I think this is very debatable. A lot of people have actually said to me that the more information we get, the less knowledgeable we become. And I think this is something that we have to be mindful of. So I know we get a lot of information. The question is that information correct? And I think this is something that I think you guys and girls in class have to be mindful of. Like the internet technically is the least reliable source of information towards any particular factor due to the fact that it's not actually valid, most of it as well. So this is something I think every particular manager should always be mindful of. Now, after looking at these competitive environments, you have to be mindful that in slide 14, there is that idea of strategic flexibility. So companies have to be mindful towards these aspects of being as flexible as possible due to the factor that it creates momentum to navigate in these ever uncertain or changing environments. By definition, a set of capabilities used to respond to various demands and opportunities existing in a dynamic and uncertain competitive environment. It involves coping with uncertainty and also accompanying risks. So companies always have to be mindful that risks are always associated with what they are ever doing, and they should never always presume that one country follows the same idea as another country, or one location follows the same idea as another location. So you have to adjust to according the idea of your demand or target markets as well. Now to continue on slide 15, you have strategic flexibility can be actually created into three key components. The first one you see is organizational slack. Now I think most of you guys and girls need to understand this concept. Slack is the idea of how much movement the company is able to basically be adaptive and also reorientate itself in regard, or be adaptive towards particular uncertainties or changes. I think this is something that I think every particular manager should always remember. It's like if you have a rubber band, like for example here, ladies and gentlemen, if you can see from my video, this is rubber band. If I pull it like this is what they call slack, of how much the maximum, like if I pull it now, this is the maximum point till it actually breaks. So this is slack, how much movement there is, okay? The next one is strategic reorientation. Now the idea of how you actually create momentum to be able to change and be adaptive towards any changes within the environment as soon as possible is something that I think is questionable towards the resources of every company. The third is capacity to learn. I think this is something that I think every particular manager should always remember. every particular manager always has to have the idea of strategic learning capacity, where you learn from your mistakes, you learn from other people or other companies, or you learn from other sources to ensure that you have the right amount of information and the right amount of techniques to basically make the most possible right decision. Therefore, you have to be mindful of this particular idea of capacity to learn. Okay, but a lot of people are very interestingly debating the idea of this due to the fact that a lot of people will always orientate capacity to learn to experiences, and I think this is actually a very good thing to basically use as a comparison, because from my idea, experiences are actually one of the best teachers. I think you have to be mindful of this. Okay, I think every particular person here in class has had a good experience in their lives or a bad experience, but technically it is still an experience, and it has shaped your mindset and your perception and your attitude. And this is something that I think every particular person should always use in the idea of being as flexible as possible. Now, on slide 16, you also have the IO model, or the industrial organizational model, which looks at above average returns. And you can actually see on this particular diagram, there are two sections of it. You have the industry environment, and then you have the competitor environment. And if you're looking at the industry environment, you always, as managers, have to look at the political and legal, global and demographic aspects in order for you to make the right decisions. But in regards to the competitor environment, you always look at the socio-cultural, technological and economic factors. Okay? Because you can't focus on everything. I think this is something that we emphasized in the week 2, which is business environment. You can't scan everything. You can't look at everything. You have to be mindful to what you are basically looking at and what you're trying to solve or deal with. Okay, so either it's an industry factor or a competitive factor. Okay, it's very rare that a company will actually deal with both, but I'm not saying it's impossible. No, but the reason why companies should focus on this is because you're actually allocating a significant amount of resources that creates momentum for you to actually either create an effective aspect of decision making, or you're basically wasting money. So in regards to this, these two environments that you see in front of you on slide 16, strategy dictated by the external environment of the firm, what opportunities exist in these environments, that's something that you should always question yourself. And then firms develop internal skills required by the external environment of what the firm can do about those opportunities. Okay? And I think an easy way to look at how these particular factors can be integrated is looking at the idea that the IO model can be related towards the SWOT analysis by looking at both strength, weakness, opportunities and threats. You have the strength, weakness, which is internal, and opportunities and threats, which is technically external. However, there are particular issues or assumptions regarding the IO model. So if we go into slide 17, the IO model, there are a few assumptions with regards, or the 4 assumptions of the IO model. The first one is it assumed the process, pressures and constraints that determine the strategies would result in above average returns. That is the first assumption. The second assumption, most firms competing within a particular industry or within a certain segment of it are assumed to control similar strategically relevant resources to pursue similar strategies in light of those resources. So you have to always be mindful in the second point that every particular company is assumed to have the same amount of capacity or resources as you or as your company. Therefore, you have to outmaneuver them in a particular way that they actually have a very hard time either duplicating or imitating in a very adaptive or flexible approach. Third, you have resources used to implement strategies are highly mobile across firms, so you actually have to be mindful of this, of all the resources that you're allocating. And the fourth, organizational decision makers are assumed to be rational and committed to acting in the firm's best interest as shown by their profit maximizing activities. So therefore, organizational decision makers are assumed to be rational and committed as always to making the right possible situation that they are encountering with the degree of capacity through dealing with uncertainty or risk association. Now, if we go into the IO model, from the external environment, as you can see on slide 19, you have the study of the external environment in regards to the industry itself, economies of scale, barriers to market entry, diversification, product differentiation, degree of concentration of firms within industry, That is the external environment. And if we go into slide 20, an attractive industry. So the IO model also gives you an idea to locate attractive industries with high potential for above average returns. Attractive industry, one whose structural characteristics suggest possible above average returns. And then you have the third one, which is strategy formulation, which is basically helped by strategic management by identifying strategy on the aspect of attractive industries to create above average returns. And strategy formulations is basically based on the selection of a strategy linked with above average returns in a particular industry itself. And then you have assets and skills, developing and requiring assets and skills needed to implement specific strategies that you are trying to create. And then strategy implementation, using the strengths of the firm itself, developing acquired assets to implement the strategy itself. And strategy implementation, in its definition, is selecting a strategy action linked with effective implementation of the chosen strategy. Now, after going all through 5 elements here in the IO model, you create the momentum to create superior returns or earning above average returns on your strategy implementation. But not all managers like using the IO model. You can always use the resource model, which is the second one here, which is resource-based model for above average returns. This particular model is a strategy dictated by the firm's unique resources or capabilities. And this goes back to the SWOT analysis. I think every particular company needs to acknowledge the factor that they have to identify what they are good at. What can they maximize, what they are weak at, what they can actually help to improve, and what threats they can deal with. And this is something I think every manager should always remember, of how to basically create momentum, to understand this concept in order for them to identify their capacity. And firms also need to basically exploit those assets and what best opportunities to basically deal with them with. It's like a lot of firms nowadays like the idea of having a multicultural or a diverse workforce. Why? Because it gives them the idea to learn, it gives them the idea to accumulate as much information as possible towards certain situations that are similar towards most people, but give you different approaches of how to solve them, of how to basically approach them, and so on and so forth. So like, for example, ladies and gentlemen, if I give one problem to just Germans, you would give me a very German answer. But if I gave the same problem to multiple nationalities or ethnicities or religions, they will give me different answers and different approaches to solve that problem due to the factor of influences of culture, perception, and attitudes that created them to actually think that particular way. So this is something I think should always be mindful in the resource-based model. Now, the resource-based model is pretty much similar towards the IO model, but there are certain factors that you have to be very different. Like, for example, in the IO model, you have the external environment that you have to identify first. In the resource model, you have to identify your resources, this is where SWOT comes in. So if you can see on slide 26, identify the firm's resources in terms of strengths and weaknesses compared with competitors. Resources inputs to firm's production process. On slide 27, determine your capabilities, look at what it can do better than its competitors, capacity of integrated set of resources to integratively perform a task or activity. Then you have the third element, which is competitive advantage, determining the potential of the firm's resources and capabilities in terms of competitive advantage, ability of a firm to outperform its rivals. Now, you have to always remember, identify your firm's capacity to be different compared to everyone else, okay? Every particular firm that is successful has a competitive advantage. The question is, what is it? It may be a product, it may be a service, it may be a process, it may be logistics, it may be the whole particular brand image. So you have to be mindful of how you determine that particular factor. The fourth one you see is the attractive industry, identifying opportunities that can be exploited by the firm's resources and capabilities. And then you have that development of a strategy formulation and also implementation, which is pretty much similar towards what we saw in the IO model. And then once you combine all those elements, you create superior returns and earning above average returns. Okay, so this is the resource-based model. Either you do it using the IO model or the resource-based model. It's so totally up to you, but these models will create a particular idea for managers and CEOs to basically look at how they create effective strategies. And then in slide 32, you have strategic intent and strategic mission. I think you guys and girls can have an idea of what is intent, which is winning competitive battles by leveraging the firm's resources, capabilities, and core competencies. It's like if you play chess, you're basically sacrificing one particular element in order for you to make the right move or make the right technique in order for you to execute correctly to get the king at the end of the particular game. So that's something that you have to be mindful of. And then you have strategic mission, an application of strategic intent in terms of products to be offered and markets to be served. Then we continue on slide 33, which is emergent and deliberate strategies. Now, strategies, as we already know, to create them, we can either use the IO model or the resource model, but you have to be mindful. Some strategies are either intended or deliberate, or some strategies are emergent. And this is something that I think we have to be mindful of. Some strategies or fantastic strategies are created due to the factor that they were never planned for. Some strategies were already in place and they already had a vision of where they wanted to go. So you have to be mindful of how these particular strategies are created. Some are deliberate, some are emergent, okay? If we can see from the intended strategies, if you look at an intended or deliberate strategy, it always starts from the beginning, the mission and vision statement, then it goes down to the external analysis, strategic choice, internal analysis, then the intended strategy, and then organizational implementation. Emergent, on the other hand, is different. It actually goes backwards. You have the organizational grassroots or the basic core fundamental aspect of the company, and then there's the strategy or the emergent strategy, and then basically has the question, does it fit to what we're actually going to do? And then you do an analysis of both the external analysis, creating a vision and mission, and then an internal analysis. And to slide 36, the types of levels of strategy that you see there are actually 4. There's functional strategy, business strategy, corporate, and lastly, global strategy. And this is something I think you learn more when you're doing your master's degree, and this actually creates momentum for you to actually look at the different types of levels that companies can actually opt for in order to create momentum for their business development and growth. And that is it for strategic management, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.